Hello everyone and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Gerry Scullion and today we speak with the one and only Dean of Design at OCAD in Toronto, author of the fantastic book which I have here, author of Design Social Change. It's Lesley-Ann Noel. And this is the precursor to another conversation that we aim to have in the next couple of months. But in this episode we speak about Lesley's past, growing up in Trinidad, and explore the parallels in our own lives where we've both dealt with post-colonialism. And we start to weave together the pieces of Lesley's own experience of working across the world that brought her to where she is today, which is an incredible leader, speaking about the decolonialism of design. It's a fantastic conversation. I know you're going to love it. I loved it. So let's jump straight in. Lesley-Ann, I am absolutely thrilled to have you on the podcast. I've been a long time admirer, and for anyone looking on YouTube, I have Lesley-Ann's book, which is a number of years old now, I think.
1 year.
2 years, isn't it?
It was released in November 2023.
23.
Yes.
I thought for a second it was 22. But you're right, because you wrote it, it's your book. So who am I to argue by saying is it right or wrong? But look, again, I'm delighted to have you here. There's loads of things we're going to talk about. I want to cover off lots of ground with you. But maybe for people who aren't aware of your incredible history and incredible work, how do you describe what you do?
That's a really difficult question because I'm going to be like all philosophical. I think I just am, right? So when people ask me what I do, I say I'm a designer.
Right.
And then if they ask me for a little bit more description, I might say something like I'm an equity-focused designer.
Nice.
But that, I think, is a new term that I started to use. And the work that people know me for is probably grounded in some level of decoloniality, some level of critical theory. And it's about me challenging this field that I belong to. And challenging it not in a theoretical way. I challenge it through methods. So, like if I see a gap or a problem, I'm immediately trying to create a method, a tool, a template, a something to get us to do things the way that I think is right, which is it sounds very subjective, but it's also very consciously me thinking about who I am, like me as a person from the Caribbean, as a Black person, as a woman, what is design for me, or what is design for people from many different groups in the world. So a lot of the work that I do is around that. So that wasn't a quick answer.
Yeah, so that was great. So you mentioned there, like, you're from the Caribbean. Whereabouts in the Caribbean are you from?
I'm from Diego Martin, Trinidad and Tobago. So the southernmost island in the Caribbean. What was that, Gerry?
You've got a great football team, Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah, a little while ago.
Yeah, a little while ago. I think Dwight York. I'm showing my footballing knowledge here. Yeah. But how long have you been outside of Trinidad and Tobago?
So officially, actually since 2015. So that's coming on 10 years.
Okay.
But I've been back and forth for most of my adult life. So I studied in Brazil. I lived in Brazil for 6 years. And then in Brazil, we had this class about globalization. And I kept saying, okay, well, I'm this global citizen. And I kind of just set up my life to be that, right? Yeah. So I would be in Trinidad for a while, and then I'd maybe find a residency somewhere and go and live somewhere else for a little while, come back.
Sure.
And then go again. So I spent some time in East Africa after in different countries in East Africa. And then I worked as a consultant with the Caribbean Export Development Agency, and that had me traveling like all around the Caribbean. So I've always been back and forth, but officially 2015 is
Okay.
when I left.
So we were talking earlier because I'm Irish and I'm, from the Republic of Ireland. So we gained our independence from British colonialism in the early 1900s. But we still have a part of our island which is still kind of co-owned and co-maintained with the British government and the Irish government, called Northern Ireland. So I've got my own perspective on colonialism. So that's the lens that I look through when I speak to you today about that. Can you tell us a little bit more around the background of what it was like growing up in Trinidad and Tobago in those formative years and how it influenced you as a change maker and as a designer?
So I grew up in Trinidad. I'm going to age myself. In the 70s, 70s and 80s. So
Yeah.
that's already post-independence. And
Okay.
that's
When did
actually, independence was 1962.
Okay.
And then we became a republic in 1976.
Right.
I was still very young in 76. I would have been about 4, right?
Okay.
But maybe then we might have had like different waves of post-coloniality.
Yeah.
And I think that the household that I grew up in was very decolonial or post-colonial. I don't know which word to use, but we were not nostalgic for colonial days at all. And so
Yeah.
I grew up in a house where we were like just very Black, very Trinidadian, or very Caribbean, because my mother's not Trinidadian. My
Yeah.
mother's from Jamaica.
Okay.
And, I think we grew up with a really strong sense of identity. My parents were, I think they were among the first graduates of the University of the West Indies. So again, they had very kind of pan-Caribbean ideas,
Yeah.
and ideas about Caribbean intellectualism and all of that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I knew families that were nostalgic for colonial days. So I would hear both conversations at the same time, people talking about, yeah, we are Trinidadians and we can do everything.
Yeah.
And I might visit some friend's house and then they'll be like, oh, in the good old days. And I'm like, what good old days? Right.
Yeah.
So it was an interesting experience, but I
Yeah.
am happy for the household that I grew up in, where I felt that anything was possible,
Yeah.
and that we could do everything with Caribbean knowledge and identity, and so I grew up like with that kind of
Yeah.
strength. Yeah.
So identity is a really nice topic to go a little bit closer into. In terms of identity, Trinidad and Tobago identity, what does that look like for you now, knowing that you've lived in all of these other places? What does it give you as a designer to be able to look through many different lenses and how you were able to reflect back on those days?
Well, having lived in more places and now having maybe a more complex view of the world, um, I'm trying to think so my Trinidadianness
Yeah.
gave me both a sense of privilege and maybe a bit of lack of privilege at the same time. But I need to acknowledge that I am from Trinidad.
Yeah.
We said this. I said this jokingly when we were chatting before. I'm from West Trinidad, which is where the oppressor classes are, and people from West Trinidad are cursing me right now. But it is, when you are from the West, you think that that's all of Trinidad, right?
Okay.
And notice that I am saying Trinidad and not Trinidad and Tobago, and that's
Yeah.
another bias, right? That
Yeah.
you kind of forget a lot of other places in the country. And I'll have to say that a lot of my experience in other places and my experience of otherness has made me much more aware of life in other parts of Trinidad and Tobago. Right? I would not have been as sensitive to all of these issues. It's not just my life in Trinidad and Tobago. It's my life in Trinidad and Tobago on top of my life in Brazil and my life in Tanzania and Mozambique and the south of the US. And, it's all of that that makes me kind of hyper aware of difference and otherness and privilege and lack of privilege and, yes, all of that.
When we're designing services or whatever it is we're designing, and we look for the people that we're going to speak with in the research phase, and we're trying to get access to those people, identity doesn't really come into it an awful lot of the time. Like a lot of the time for designers, they tend to lean, and myself is included, we look for the behaviors behind it. It's very hard to sometimes understand and unpack what identity means.
Mm-hmm.
What advice do you give to design researchers out there who really want to include the importance of identity? Because I think identity is a very complex thing to really unpack for an individual. Is it possible, as a side question as well, for people to hold more than one identity at the same time?
Yes, definitely people can hold, people have many different facets of their identity all the time. We have, of course, it sounds like schizophrenia if I describe it like this, but we do have multiple identities all the time, and we sometimes have to figure out which hat we are wearing in which situation. I think if I could just go back for a second to your last question about what life in Trinidad has taught me about identity, it is, it could be about people's strength, or sometimes, the strength of the opinion that you might get from a place that you don't expect it, right? Like, people in Trinidad and Tobago, in the Caribbean in general, people can be very bold and direct and will tell you what they think. And I think when I went to, for example, the United States, I would sometimes find that people didn't expect poor people, I'm saying in quotes,
Yeah, air
to have
quotes.
an opinion, air quotes, yes, or didn't expect older people, again in air quotes, to have an opinion. And people in the Caribbean, in a place like Trinidad or in a place like Jamaica, people are very, very strong and forceful about their opinions. And I would say then maybe that makes me very aware of needing to hear people's stories
Yeah.
and listen. So I personally don't enjoy big data as much as I do hearing like
Anecdotal.
individual stories, anecdotal, yeah, people's real stories about something. And I know that sometimes we have to use big data, but we have to. For me, when I try to do research, then I'm trying to overlap the two things so
Human.
that, yes, I'm trying to humanize the data because
Absolutely.
people have very human stories that we have to hear.
At its core, like it's really interesting to hear you speak about Trinidad and your upbringing and stuff. That whole kind of era was very similar to mine. Like, I grew up, I was born in the late 70s. One half of my family is Northern Irish, and they had to leave Northern Ireland due to the Troubles. We owned a post office, was being held up all the time by like the Republican Army in Ireland. But we got out of that, and I still think in Ireland we're still dealing with an awful lot of that trauma that lives on intergenerationally between forefathers and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What's it like from your perspective when you go back to Trinidad with those multiple lenses that you've garnered from traveling around the world and so forth? How are they dealing with their post-colonial past in Trinidad? What impact?
So I think so. I mentioned earlier in our conversation, some families that are in fact nostalgic for
You mentioned that,
colonial. Yeah, and I think that in some places and in some forms of service delivery, I think that it's sometimes it's almost like they're punishing people. I think that thing of people needing to suffer
Mm.
as they receive a service, I see that as a form of colonialism manifesting itself. You know
Yeah.
so I think for me, I had this discussion with a colleague of mine in Brazil some time ago, and we were talking about service delivery in post-colonial societies, how we sometimes felt that there was a tie to um, like slavery societies and the
Yeah.
way services are delivered in some places. So I'll give you an example. I'm going
Yeah.
to go and renew my passport or my driver's license, and I just have to suffer through the whole process. And if I complain about it, it's almost like I'm not entitled to anything better, right? And maybe this is maybe it's the same. I'm now in another country and I'm saying that, okay, it's the same problem maybe everywhere. But when I think about it, when I'm in Trinidad, I think that this is somehow tied to our colonial past,
Yeah.
and thinking that poor people, working class people, don't have the right to anything better.
Mm.
Um, Again, that could be the same everywhere in the world, but I think of it as um, tied to that. But there's another thing that maybe a little unrelated, but it is an impact, I think, of, or it is a manifestation of post colonialism. Um, Remember, I said also people are very vocal,
Yeah.
right? I think that some of that is also a post-colonial thing, right? Where people in Trinidad can be very irreverent, right? And so they'll say something like they'll kind of point a finger at you and say, well, massa day done, right? I'm not, you cannot boss me around. I'm not your slave. I'm not, and you get that kind of attitude all over,
Yeah.
all the time in Trinidad, that strong reaction to, hey, colonialism and slavery and plantation systems and the plantocracy, all of that has ended, and you cannot control me because of
Mm.
that. Um, Even though at the same time, there are a lot of places where people are, in fact, very controlled. But I think that people um, are open and vocal about telling everybody that you cannot control me, that
Yeah.
those times are over and I have moved beyond that.
So the lingering kind of colonial past, there's still behaviors there that people are trying to kind of shed that skin, so to speak, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
I can see that in Ireland as well. And it's funny that you brought this up, this whole kind of, you notice it in culture where people say, oh, I'm sorry, you bump into somebody in the street, I'm sorry. Like it's this whole kind of like constant request for
Mm.
forgiveness, even though like
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't your fault, and it's interesting to see the parallels between the both post-colonial kind of the impacts.
Yes.
Can I talk to you a little bit more around when you were educated from a design perspective? So I want to understand and unpack that a little bit more around, you're coming from that mindset, that whole kind of your childhood, your formative years, and now you're being educated as a designer. What parts of the design process were the most contentious for you when you were dealing with and exploring design and you could see its colonial past?
So I did not see coloniality in the design process during my early design education,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
I started design in school in Trinidad,
Yeah.
um, and I don't, it didn't seem to be an issue there. The way I was taught design and was learning design, doing design in Trinidad, it did not seem to enter
The
um,
consciousness.
the consciousness. And I did undergrad. I did industrial design in Brazil, and I was just kind of excited about being in Brazil. There may have been, not even may have been, somebody will write you and say, yes, there was. But I'll say it like this. There may have been coloniality in the way we approached things.
Yeah.
But again, I couldn't see it then.
Okay.
And maybe it's me now as an older person and much more confident in my view of the world. It's like in my 40s. Oh, actually, maybe even my 30s. I started to see coloniality in the way design for development projects would take place. And I actually worked as a consultant with design for development agencies for many years when I was with that Caribbean Export, that development agency. So development is a whole colonial idea, right? The idea that you're going to go and develop people or develop, like people in other places, right? It's all colonial. And then when you add design to that, it can get a lot worse. And so actually, I would do these projects where I was hired as a designer to work with craftspeople, to work with small businesses, manufacturers, all that, to help them prepare products for export. But I struggled with that work. And then I had the guilt of being paid for that work. So, I had the intellectual struggle and then the guilt of, okay, I'm doing this. Yeah, I'm doing this stuff and I'm getting paid.
Yeah.
But that is actually part of there were a lot of things that drove me to do a PhD. And that was part of it as well, trying to rationalize. And in the end, my PhD was not about that at all, but it was me trying to rationalize the way we as designers were imposing design decisions on other people, and I couldn't decide if this was doing good or if it was doing harm. And if even if you speak with me today, on some days I'll say maybe we were doing good, and some days I'll say we were doing harm. I would certainly do the work differently today than I did 15 years ago or 20 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So now you're in design education, isn't that correct?
Yes.
You're in Toronto.
I'm in Toronto. I'm the Dean of Design at OCAD University.
Yeah, which is absolutely fantastic. Like, as I said, I've been a number of years, I've been following, where you've been and stuff. And this is a relatively new role in Toronto. Not Toronto.
Yeah, we have to say it right. And actually, there's the Indigenous pronunciation. I have not mastered the Indigenous pronunciation of Toronto. Is Tikaronto, I think.
Tikaronto. Very nice.
Yeah.
So before we get on the call, I know I'm hopping around from Billy to Jack here a little bit. And I was fixing something on my desk here, and I've been reading your book at the same time over the last couple of days, and like the power of my subconscious, I started to reflect. Maybe there's something in that as well. When I'm disconnecting, my brain is processing things. But my whole kind of experience with, colonialism, as I said, I had a difficult enough relationship with it. And it wasn't until when I was in Australia the very first time, or the second time, and I was researching with, people in South Sydney in an Indigenous area, and they said that I was okay. And they said I was okay because I was Irish. Mm-hmm. I says, oh, tell me why. And they says, well, we know what you've been through and what we've been through is very similar. And I was like, oh, okay, well, first of all, I haven't been through it. I said, my family's history of being through it. And they said, oh, well, that's one and the same and how we see it. But up until that point, I'd really had a complex perspective of colonialism and how I saw that. But now I'm starting to see it almost as in some ways, a blessing that I'm able to look at the world through that lens. Mm-hmm. Now we've identified that we've got a similar trajectory in our lives. What are you doing in regards how you're evolving design education in OCAD when you're bringing those lenses back into the work.
Yeah, so before I came to OCAD, before I became an administrator, I was a researcher. I was a research track professor, and
Yeah.
my work focused on equity.
Mm-hmm.
And as I mentioned earlier, I would challenge design processes and then try to embed more equity into everything.
Yeah.
And that, I assume, is part of what made OCAD call me, right? Actually, I had a conversation with a senior person at OCAD who said, "We think that you are nimble and responsive, and that's what we're interested in."
Yeah.
And so all of that to say, when I came here, I was impressed by the work that's already happening on the ground.
Mm.
Of course, I knew the work that my predecessor had been doing, but that all of that is for me to say, I don't have to do as much as I thought I would have to do because they're already doing it. Because
Okay.
a lot of people at OCAD are already very reflective already. Maybe not everybody, but I think that there is an interest, there is a mandate.
Yeah.
There is a mandate for decolonizing curriculum here.
Okay. Not
It's
in
part of
Canada
the
or in OCAD.
at OCAD. It's part of the
Okay.
strategic plan.
Okay.
There is a mandate to include Indigenous learning outcomes. There is, so there are a lot of things that are happening even before I got here.
Yeah.
So I have to figure out, okay, what do I do now? But
Yeah.
my job now is a support role. That's what I've been telling people. My job is to support people in making sure they're doing these things. And then because I'm coming from a fairly broad design practice,
Mm.
I'm now, okay, if I put back on my researcher hat a little bit, I'm trying to write a little bit more about what people are doing here because people here are doing stuff,
Yeah.
which might not mean they have time to write about it. But
Yeah.
I know that in the design education world, people are looking for case studies. They're looking for examples of practice. They're looking, and I've only been here for 2 months, and I can see that there are examples that other people around the world would be interested in. For example, like how do you weave Indigenous learning outcomes into an illustration class?
And how do you
Or
do? Tell me.
oh gosh, no, don't ask me that yet. I can't answer that yet. But I know that these are the conversations. Actually, there's a type class, not Indigenous learning outcomes. There's a type class that is fascinating by a professor called Diane McKell. And Diane teaches a multilingual type class that respects the fact that people in the class speak different languages and use different alphabets. And so it's not a class that imposes English on people. And there are a few other professors here at OCAD who are doing work like that. Isabel Morales is another one who is, again, not imposing English on students. And so people can bring in their multilingual identities, their multi-alphabetic identities, if that's a word, into the classroom. And so all of these things that are already happening, I hadn't seen, or I have not seen in a lot of other places, right?
Yeah.
I was in a staff meeting and the industrial design people said, well, okay, how do we do a decolonial industrial design class? I haven't been in a place where people are asking these kinds of questions before.
That is something that, a lot of people are looking to
Yes.
learn.
Yeah.
So I know we're probably close enough for time here for Lesley, but like you're one of the people that has risen, and your book Design Social Change starts to tackle some of these things. But How do you respond to those questions when people say, how do you redesign a class? So in industrial design.
So I start off, in design social change, one of the big ideas is about building a critical awareness of the world. And I've been toying with a decolonial industrial design class for a long time, because that's my discipline. I don't have an answer yet, but I've started to think, well, maybe it is about talking more intentionally about materials, for example, and where materials come from, and the labor that's involved in the material, and the people, and like if we're seeing the real world around the objects that we're making, that could be one way of starting to make the class more critical, right, and make the class less focused in some of the historical precedents, which are good and interesting and relevant for some things, but not necessarily for others. So like if we are being decolonial, we are probably breaking some of those historical paths and asking some new questions. And so for me, one of the questions is about that, seeing the world and the materials and the processes and everything a little bit more critically in the process. And there are other things I'm gonna learn with the people that I'm working with as we move along. Yeah,
Lesley, it's been a fantastic introduction to speaking with you today. Like, your book, as you mentioned, it's 1 year old, by the way. I just want to put that out. It's 1 year old for anyone listening at the start. It was published by the Stanford D School, is that right?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, they did. Okay, so you can get it. You can get it most places. I think I ended up getting this on Amazon. Unfortunately, it was the only option that I could get in Ireland at the moment. But please, if you're near an independent bookstore, try and go independent if you can, folks. I heard on the grapevine that the CEO of Amazon is doing very well for himself and doesn't need any more.
No, there are lots of independent bookstores, and I recommend people find an independent bookstore and see if they'll ship it to you.
Yeah, 100%. People can find out more about you on LinkedIn, which I'll put a link to your LinkedIn in there as well. Is there any other places that you usually direct people to find out more about your work, Lesley?
Really, LinkedIn and Instagram are the easiest places to find me. I should be findable via OCAD's website now. LinkedIn and Instagram are great places to find me. And I continue conversations. I mean, people can really reach out and chat, and I'll respond. Yeah,
absolutely. Listen, thank you so much for your time, Lesley-ann. It was absolutely brilliant getting to know you a little bit better today. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.